I hope to show you that the little now remains is actually extraordinarily significant, and I think there's a lot more of the archaeology of this site surviving than even I appreciated when we first started to examine the site. Partially because, as we can see from this first slide, that it was heavily overgrown until just last year. And so I'm going to say a bit about, at the beginning, the initial work that we did before we started the archaeological exploration, of which I've been working with many of you. It's nice to see so many familiar faces. A huge amount of effort going on. I want to stress that as well tonight, is that it's not just us coming in and helping you do this work. There's been a massive amount of effort, and I've been really impressed and pleased to work with you, some of you, out at the site. And we've got lots of thorns stuck in our hands and dragged lots of vegetation about, and kept with me, sticking probes in the grounds and tapes in the pouring rain. So there'll be lots of thank yous from me tonight, because I don't want to claim this work. This is very much your work. And here's some of that work going on. We had a range of volunteers out, not just from the Bernardi Heritage Preservation Group, but also from local community volunteers, young people looking for a bit of work experience. We had people through from the college at Cooper as well. A whole range of different individuals. So it was really nice getting to know people who are interested in our local heritage and willing to give up a free day. Here's some of you, and actually very close to a massive amount of vegetation we cleared in just the space of what was essentially a few days last November. And I should also say Caroline Colley here tonight from Living Lomonds, our volunteer team. If anyone's interested in volunteering for something similar, you haven't tried, Caroline's your lady to talk to. Just go on, Caroline, put your hand up. There we go, excellent. And so Caroline was helping me there as well. It's made a massive difference. Suddenly, although we've seen from some of the historic diagrams that these sites are, the site has been detailed, there's drawings done of it once the remains were standing, we can now see what we've got, which is a brilliant start. And as Ed will tell you, it's very important as part of the restoration process to be able to assess how much it costs, apart from anything, to keep it from falling down. And there's a lot surviving. So we've got fragments of the Barnkin wall here. These four corners of the structure are really significant as well. They're massive walls as well, approximately 4 feet to 6 feet thick in places, a highly fortified location. They're also very important, as I'll tell you in a little while during the talk, in that they preserve fragments of the interior of this building that let us actually start to understand how each of the rooms worked. Even though they're not there anymore, we can still start to reconstruct something of the functioning of how this castle lived, bringing it back to life in a sense. But the primary archaeology that I'm going to tell you about is a type of archaeology that many of you might have seen on TV quite a lot. Time Team used to use it a great deal. It's geophysics. Lots of beeping machines and technical scientific equipment, but essentially it's the main technique that archaeologists use to scan beneath the ground before they even pick up a trowel. And I'm a great proponent of this, and in many ways most archaeological projects, they start with this as a benchmark, because again it helps tell you what you've got and helps you quantify decisions about the site. So we've done a variety of techniques. In fact, we've pretty much thrown everything at the site. We've got resistivity, which is an electrical technique. It can help you find things like walls and buried ditches, and generally it tells you how the buried archaeology affects the path of a current, and that can tell you something about what it's possibly made of. We've got a fluctuating radiometer, a technical name for it, essentially a magnetic survey. It's an electromagnetic technique. It can tell you an additional piece of information. You can also find walls depending on what they're made of, but it can also tell you where burning is, industrial activity. So it's an extra bit of information really. And radar, this is a very powerful technique, ground penetrating radar as it's usually called. Another electromagnetic technique, but it essentially is so powerful because it can penetrate very deep into the ground and give you depth information. So it takes slices essentially like layers in a cake. You can start to see where the strata is in relation to each other, where walls might be, how deep down they are. Which at a site which used to be on an island in a loch is a very useful thing to use. And here's the area of the survey we wanted to do. Now, one of the other great things about the vegetation clearance and part of our plan was to allow us to actually do this survey, because this was all covered in scrub. It would have been impossible until we'd done that. And so we've tried to survey as much of the available ground as we could within reason. There's still quite a lot of undergrowth around here. But essentially, this line here isn't the island. This is the protected outline of what's called the scheduled monument area. So we're not allowed to do anything inside there without permission, otherwise we break the law. And we got permission to do our survey across that area. So the main aim was to try and assess what remains are under the ground and how they relate to the standing remains. These are the walls, I should add, that are still standing up. And how the outside of the island, the base of the loch, related to that. And can we find any interesting, juicy things about what's going on at the edges of the loch? Because we've already heard about the mysterious causeway, which traditionally has been associated with this site, and some people have said it was related to the east and south end of the loch. So that's one of the things we were tasked to try and find. And we also wanted to understand, how did people get onto the island if they didn't use the causeway? How did the approach work if supposedly our drawings showed that the entrance was somewhere here on the west? So all of these things we're trying to piece together through our circle plots. So this is our resistivity survey, sometimes referred to offhand as RES. And what it shows you at first, lots of blobs, different coloured black and white areas and grey. But the main thing to look at is this is our graph, and it tells you what these different degrees of colours mean. So in this case, the dark areas are very high resistance. So that's normally where there's buried gravels or stony material or something that's stopping your current passing. And why that's significant in this site is because we expected to find walls, so the high resistance would normally indicate that. But we're also trying to understand where exactly were the boundaries of this island. I mean, we don't really even know that to begin with. We know there's a big mountain there, but how far did the loch come up? And we would normally expect some kind of beach material or sandy deposits in the base of the loch. And I think this is what we started to find in this area. This is quite far off the mound of the island, and what we're finding is big bands of material. And these are probably gravel banks, essentially, in the loch base. And we've got a really nice curving area here. And I think immediately we can start to say, well, this is actually probably the beach of the island. And it's very clear. We're into the loch deposits here. There's also been a lot of land change here, as many of you know. Bing material was spread across the west and the north of the island, and also landfill material. So that explains why it's very messy down here as well. So there's a kind of gradient spectrum of preservation across the site. But generally on the east side it looks like we're getting the outline of the island. And this little plot here is intended to help you get your eye into some of these highs and low areas. But don't worry if it looks quite complex to start with. I'm going to take you through some elements of this. So this is what I think is the roughly curving arc of the beach of the island. And these really high readings here are walls. And we've got really good definition of it. And even by looking at that, hopefully you can start to see, okay, maybe we're starting to get most of the remains that we see today are probably post-dating the time of Adam de Vallonis, or de Valance. Although he is most likely the man associated with this Inchgal name, I think. Because in most of the charters, it's him who's identified as the Lord of Inchgal. Now it might be possible that Robert might have used the island in some way, and he's certainly a stranger, but all the historical evidence says Adam is the man of Inchgal, the Lord of Inchgal. The other reason why I just wanted to throw you this summary of the lords of this area is that most of the standing remains that we see, the Tower House as these castles are known, is probably dating from the early 14th century, perhaps just the late 13th century, but most of it is 15th to 16th century. That's just on architectural grounds. So when you're thinking about who's built this castle, who's living it in the form that you see today, it's really the Wardlaws, and that's stressed by the fact that in the 19th century there was an inscription across the gateway into the tower which said Robertus de Wardlaw, so Robert of Wardlaw. So the Wardlaws put their stamp on this structure, very much so. I just wanted to reiterate the fact here that the castle farm is much earlier than most of the remains that we're talking about here as well. So the castle that we're looking at is post-dating the 14th century. The archaeology around the Barmkin wall. So we've got these indications of high resistance readings around it, so we can see we've filled in the gaps, and that's important. It tells us that the building foundations, the walls, the actual rocks are still in place, likely around the exterior. On this side, mostly robbed out. But in this corner, we've started to pick up features around some of the corners about other structures around the interior and the exterior of the wall. So we've got this large reading here. That looks like it could be some kind of building structure abutting the corner of this wall. And we know there was probably a tower at this wall. And that's interesting. It could be a little gatehouse, for instance. It could be some kind of latrine block down here. I think possibly what we're dealing with at the northeast corner is the remains of this tower, which has collapsed now. But we can start to visualise it quite well. We've got this plan that David showed us, published by Adam de Cardano, and we've also got this outline shown in the 19th century by McGibbon and Ross, and they show this rather nice circular feature with a gun loop on it. So this is probably part of the defensive works developed from the 15th, 16th century rather. So we have a defensive piece here, but we've also got a little secret gate shown in the edges of it, which is rather nice. And we can see some fragmentary remains of that gate if we then return to the site using our geophysics and our archaeological eyes looking at the structure. We can actually see the outline of the inner curve of this tower here, and we can make out some of the facings of this gate entranceway. And I would argue that this is actually part of that secret gate. A lot of castles have these small gateways, these posterns, which essentially allow ready access for people who you want in. They also let you get out through a secret entranceway if you like. And there are also these high resistance responses correlate pretty well with some of our historic illustrations, and they show us, I think, that we've got at least two structures hard up against here. We've got this range structure here, the foundations of which are still visible on the ground. We've also got what seems to be these linear readings here that may be indicating a gatehouse, as we can see in some of the illustrations. And the structure of this gateway was quite substantial. We can also see in the standing remains again, when we return to it, we've got this remains of a bolt hole going straight through the wall. This is a very large, square timber beam, suggesting that we've got a significant, very big door here. And it's great to have these little fragments actually preserved. So we have to bear in mind that this wall is leaning quite a lot. We've got walls coming in at the back here. How are we going to look after this? What we're going to do with these pieces of information. We've got additional pieces of information, geophysics, about the foundations of these structures here. There's two standing walls here. And these are probably ranges, ancillary ranges added on to the tower from the late medieval period. So these may have housed kitchens, they may have housed men-at-arms. This is really indications of the fact that you've got a little community essentially living on this island. Other details that geophysics has allowed us to talk about these buildings is that we've got little indications of interior divisions and some of the doorways. So we're starting to be able to reconstruct, the form of this structure, and we've also got little indications of perhaps added on fragments of these buildings, which might be exterior staircases, and other occupational features of the structure. We can also have a look at the walls of the tower next to these, and you can point out some gable end fragments. So this is where the actual roof of this structure, this range that I was just showing you, the fragments of its foundations are visible here. And this shows us that this is a two-storey building as well, supporting again the details from the illustrations of the site. And one of the things about reconstructing our understanding of these buildings is not just interesting itself, it also tells us about something of the use of space within the building. It's very sort of tight and controlled sense of entry to the site. So you've got your gatehouse here, your entranceway, and then you've got a first courtyard. Some indications of less substantial remains. I posit that some of these large readings could be post pads. On some of these castles you would have little lean-to structures hard up against the inside of these barbican or curtain walls. These could be other important archaeological remains within the building. And then beyond it we've got quite a distinct range of readings on the east. And this is a much larger courtyard, and you're really within the inner sanctum here once you've got to this stage. We've got hints of what could be drainage, so drains on cobbled surfaces perhaps. You'd need to keep the water out of the interior. And we've also got indications of quite a deep humic soil around here. It's quite distinct from anything else. Perhaps occupation deposits, so they expect it to be quite clean. It may be build up of vegetation from the trees that were present at the site for many years. Crucially, more drains down here, but we've also got this indication of a previously unknown part of the structure on the east side of the tower. This looks like we might have an east range or an additional segment of the building added on to the east side of the tower. And there is some supporting evidence of this when we return to look
on the west side. So we're back around the west here. McGibbon and Ross showed us that even 100 years ago there was a lot more surviving at this part of the building. In fact, there was a gateway into the structure, and we can still see one side of that gateway. So you can probably see these stones coming up above. This is the vault of the gate, and we've got a door jamb just here. And this is an interesting point, and it shows us the entry into the castle was via this building here. So you've come through your gate, your guard has given you entrance. If you're expected by the Lord, you're then coming perhaps through an exterior staircase, perhaps not, onto the second level of this building, and you're then into the inner sanctum of what seems to be the hall on the first floor. And we can tell that because there's indications of a fireplace. And here's a fragment of that fireplace. So this is probably the only piece of, sort of designed diagnostic, as we'd say, architectural fragment here. We've got the spring of the arc of this fireplace and the chimney flue going up above. And we can again see some vaulting from that. So imagine, if you will, you're on the first floor of Lochore Castle, and you've come through the gateway and you're immediately into the hall. There's a raging fire here. There's a long table with the Lord at the head of it, his servants beside. You're really going to behave yourself when you're coming into this inner sanctum. So we can start to kind of reimagine the function of this place. I've already said a bit about this wing at the side. Well, what could this have been? Well, again, when we return to the building, we can see some tusking stones, these are called. So these are stones protruding from the face of the tower. And these are good indications because they tell you that there would have been another wall added on to this part of the structure. They don't seem to come through in the lower level. They may have originally, but our well-meaning friend Eddie Henderson seems to have repaired part of this, part of the wall face here and the cobbled stones that have been removed. So he may have actually masked the presence of that structure. But nonetheless, he's also stopped it falling down, so we have to thank him for that. We can try to get a sense about what the east wing might have actually been when we look at the detail of these inner walls. And as I said, the structure that we still have preserves part of the details and story of these rooms. And we can see that there's a floor level here, some facing for the interior of rooms. So within the actual walls of the east side there were rooms. So it tells us already that there must have been an extension to the building here. But we've also got other little details, like up here there's a little aubrey as it's called. It's a little cupboard. So this is probably, you're into the inner sanctum of the building here. You're on the second floor and there are little bedrooms, and this is where the Lord's inner sanctum would have been. And there may well have been a little shrine or a chapel within this. So moving on our geophysics, we've also got some magnetic data, and here's some of it. It was a smaller area. It's a technique that needs a lot more space to survey, so we couldn't do so much. But it was useful. It generally supported the resistivity, but it also showed us some key areas of disturbance. So where you get magnetic disturbance, it usually means you've got either occupational activity or industrial activity of some kind. And it's no surprise that most of the disturbance we've got is around our range buildings. So this might have been where you had little ancillary smiths who would repair things within the castle. It might have also been where you get a lot of midden material muck from people. Here we have some of the radar results as well. These are the profile lines from which we took them. As I said, lots of slices across the site. And here are some of those profiles. They're incredibly dense, essentially, with data. But what they show us is they support what we've already found in some of the data. So you can hear here these banding effects where it disappears in. We're in the loch bed here, the island shore becoming more disturbance, the outline of our island, and then a big wall here for the barnacle. So essentially it's giving us a sense of the depth of the island, and if we were to do an excavation here, we would have some very refined data that we could very pinpointedly tell us exactly where everything is. We've also got at the gate here, so we've got the evidence of these building remains. All these jaggy responses here is always indications of rubble, so there's lots of buried rubble material that we'd have to go through if we were to investigate this. Here is a new plan, as it were, for the island based on the geophysics. I want to say some of this are possibles and some of them are more definite. So we've got definite remains of two turrets that we found in the geophysics, but we can now see in fragments of the building. Now it's guided our eye in. And it stresses the fact that this was one of the strongest castles in Fife, these massive towers on the building. But one of the things I haven't said too much about yet, just wanted to leave at the end, is that the resistivity showed us that there are a series of cuttings into the island on the southeast side. And they also show us that there's a great whacking high resistance response going across to the southeast here. And I think these are elements of the access routes to the castle. So we've got large high resistance readings going out into the loch. These may be pontoons, it's the kind of thing we might expect. Nice simple cut harbours. So it starts to kind of bring to life something about, you know, the functioning of the site. You'd have boats moored on the island, boundaries, you'd have people coming in and out, being watched from the turrets. It's quite unusual to be on an island, in a sense, for a high Norman lord, in a sense. A lot of these guys are very interested at an early stage in Motte and Bailey castles, and then large castellated sites, normally on elevated points. But it is a particularly Scottish thing to do. I mean, people do have islands, castles elsewhere in Britain and Europe, but there is a lot of island castles in Scotland and in fact Ireland. These guys are supposed to be strangers, they're supposed to be Frenchmen. They're not really behaving like it, I would argue, by establishing their site on this island and moving their site to this island. So I just wanted to put some new thoughts into the air. And this is something that these projects let us do as well. It'd be great to hear your thoughts on this. A few examples of other island sites in Scotland, a particularly nice one down in Galloway, the Gall name there. Three Castle, which is on a Douglas Castle, and it's on a river. Many of you might have been there. And there we have one of these causewayed sites and a little pontoon harbour as well for it. And when that was excavated by Chris Abraham, huge amounts of remains came out of this site, really well preserved leather and woodworking. So there's potential that under the island here, on the fringes of the island at Lochore, we may have similar very rich remains as well. Closer to home at Lochore, we have quite an early tower house, also on an island, of course. But primarily, most of the island castles in Scotland come from the north and in the west. And I think this association with parts of Fife reminds us that people still spoke Gaelic in Fife in the 12th century. And you know, there was a great deal of Gaelic culture around in Scotland, even into the late medieval period, in places that we think of as pretty much lowland today. So Castle Cheerham, the great clan castles of the one of the reasons why the Normans might have chose this site is because it had earlier significance. And David touched on this point before, that Robert the Burgundian might have used it, and Simon Taylor suggested this, but maybe there's something even earlier under this castle. Maybe it was a crannog, you know, one of these island dwellings of early medieval status. Or maybe it was a gathering place for Gaelic lords previously to the arrival of our Norman this year we're doing another big dig. You might have heard of our big dig up on East Lomond Hill Fort last year. We've got 3 of these digs to do. This year we really wanted to bring that to Lochore. So we're talking to Historic Scotland, the rich south of the loch, where there's a whole range of other amazing prehistoric remains, and we will see, and we'll let you know as soon as possible once we have our decision from the powers on high about exactly where our dig will be. But we're looking forward to it, and we'd really like to see many of you come along to that. We'll be doing some more guided walks as well as we approach August, so please do come along to some of those.